Hello, welcome to episode 34 of the Intern's Oddities from around the world. Now, today we will be discussing Nicolas Flamel and whether or not he was truly an alchemist, as people claim that he was, because he's been presented a few times throughout pop culture, uh, such as, personally, for me, I saw him in the Harry Potter movie, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, or Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone here in the States. I don't know if it's all the states. In Tennessee, at least, it was called the Sorcerer's Stone. But I've heard that in Europe it was called the Philosopher's Stone. So, and I actually had an old PS1 game, but sorry, getting sidetracked. So, anyways, that's who we're going to be discussing today. And I decided to look into him a little bit since we were talking about, alchemy already and ancient alchemists. So I decided I would look into another popular alchemist for the sideshow today. And, well, I might have some bad news. It turns out that he may have just been an ordinary person like you or me. All the details of him being an alchemist may have been greatly exaggerated. So here's what I found out. Apparently, Nicolas Flamel was born in the early 1300s, 1313 I believe it was. And what they said is he grew up and he started selling books when he grew up. And he became like a bookseller. And bookseller back then meant something a little different than it does today, but not too much different. He still sold books, of course, but one of the things that made it different back then was the bookseller typically had to bind the books, not necessarily write the text of the books, but more so like they would take they did write text. It's complicated. Basically what they did is he would take the texts that other people had written and he would rewrite them in his own handwriting and compile them together and bind them into books so that other people could read them, and then he would sell them. Well, the legend goes, as the story goes, they say that one day a strange man came into his shop and offered to sell him a book for $50. Might sound a little expensive to us in our modern times. $50 for a book. We can get books for like, I don't know, $8 to $20, depending on the format. And so, a lot of people might think that's a bit expensive. But you also have to consider that during this time period, books were excessively rare and not many people could read books. They were not as well educated as some people are today. Many of them were not as well educated. And so books were rare, highly valuable, and highly expensive. So to him, even though it technically would only cost the modern day equivalent of $50 at the time, that still was basically a steal for him, because from my understanding, the modern day equivalent of the cost of a book back then by today's standards, books probably would have been maybe anywhere from $80 to $100 with inflation, from what I can tell. So he felt like he was getting a pretty good deal with this book. That's the point I'm trying to make here, okay? So he bought this book and he started looking through the book and he saw these weird symbols in it, and he realized what he had just bought was an alchemy book. So he studied it, and over time, he was eventually able to start deciphering parts of it. And as the legend goes, this book told him how to make the Philosopher's Stone. Pretty interesting stuff here. So what he did is he read the book, he took notes, he did the practice, and they say that he started to gain wealth and nobody knew where it was coming from. And this is where it gets a little gray, a little bit in the gray area. So I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but for now, just follow along with me. So later on, a few years later, he started to have massive amounts of wealth and nobody knew where it had come from. So they all thought, oh, he must have, he must have completed the Philosopher's Stone and learned how to turn lead into gold. So that's where he's getting all this money. Nope, not that simple. So he was not turning lead into gold. According to my fact checking, oh, let me finish the story and then I'll get back to the fact checking. Okay? Sorry. So first off, after he, got the book and he started making all this wealth and all this money, they started naming streets after him. Like they literally had a couple of streets named after him and, some buildings named after him and everything. So he was like lots and lots and lots of money, like rich man status, And so they said that he had acquired the Philosopher's Stone and was turning lead into gold to acquire money. All right. And he had a wife named Perenelle, and she, according to legend, so keep in mind, according to legend, I'll get back to this in a minute, was just of average wealth. That like they did well for themselves between his bookstore and her family. They did well for themselves. They weren't poor, but they also weren't rich by any means until he started, getting streets named after him. And so, many years later, they go on, they pass away, they eventually move on, not to another town. I'm trying to keep it clean for YouTube because they're weird about stuff. I don't know. But, so they eventually pass away and people are very suspicious about them. So they keep on and they keep on and they keep on making all these rumors about how he found the Philosopher's Stone and created the elixir of immortality. So they convinced the church to go dig up the bodies, and they dig up the coffins, right? And guess what was in the coffin? Well, it wasn't their bodies. Yep, the coffins were empty. So they said that he had actually completed the elixir of immortality and was off living a carefree life after having faked their deaths. Oh, because he also gave some to his wife, Perenelle, as well, apparently. They say he gave her some as well, and they faked their deaths, and they went off to go live other lives. And they say that this is actually a common thing that alchemists do when they're trying to, you know, have the elixir of immortality. It says that many of the alchemists who gain the elixir of immortality and are able to have this power will often, stay in one area for a set period of time, but eventually they will have, after every 20 or 30 years or so, they will try to pick up roots and leave and move somewhere else so that 20 to 50 years would probably be more appropriate. But regardless of the exact time frame, every once in a while they would pick up and leave, and go somewhere else so that people didn't start to question, hey, why hasn't this person aged a single day? It's been like 30 years. They don't have any more wrinkles. They don't have any liver spots. They just look young, healthy. How did they look like this when it's been like 30 years, So they supposedly moved around a lot every so often so people wouldn't recognize them or, whatever. Change the name, blah, blah, blah. Witness protection. It was essentially a self-induced witness protection, would be a good way of looking at it and summarizing it very quickly. So They kept moving around, and eventually they got caught. And they found them, and they're just like living for hundreds of years and stuff. And now we're gonna go back, and we're gonna do some breakdowns. So I've got some bad news for you. If you were hoping this was a true story of alchemy, turns out all these stories of people seeing them in 17th century England, countless years, like over 100 years after their death and all this stuff. There's been countless stories over the centuries. Apparently, it turns out all these stories are completely 100% unverifiable, and there's no supporting evidence, and it's most likely just a bunch of people talking because they knew that he was an alchemist, and so they just made up all these rumors. Supposedly, he was an alchemist. Oh yeah, it gets worse. There's also no evidence to support that he was actually an alchemist. There's no, like, from what I can tell, it didn't look like he wrote any books. Even the one book that claimed was written by him was actually, from my understanding, published posthumously, and it's very difficult to verify who actually uploaded or distributed that book. But also, the alchemy book that he supposedly bought from this other man for $50, they did find that book, and they found out when it was written, over 100 years after he had passed away. So what they're trying to say is there's no way that he could have possibly have bought that book, because that book wasn't going to exist for at least another 100 years. And I'm not gonna lie, I've always, I grew up with this story of Nicolas Flamel, and it wasn't talked about widely or very often, but in the few times in pop culture I'd heard it, I always thought it was very interesting. The concept of immortality. And while we're talking about immortality, I am a strong believer that there is actually a difference between immortality and invincibility. Now, while someone who is invincible may not feel physical pain, I do believe that even someone who is invincible could still get sickness. I'm not sure what word YouTube wants me to use there. But, they can get stuff in their body like germs, and, I feel like that could still harm them or even destroy them, even if they're invincible. While someone who is immortal, here's the thing, they will not pass away through natural means if they are immortal. They'll not get any of that, germs. That won't bother them. But even an immortal person is susceptible to lethal attacks. So if you actually try to physically assault an immortal, I do believe you could have success with that. I believe the immortality only relates to natural causes. But that's a whole other side tangent. I just wanted to get that off my chest real quick, because that is my personal belief on the difference between immortality and invincibility. So there is not really any evidence to support any of the claims about um about Nicolas Flamel, unfortunately, which I found to be very disappointing. And the deeper you look into it, the more and more it seems like completely made up stories years and years after the fact, because people just wanted to make others believe in alchemy, and they're like, what better way to make people believe in alchemy than tell them a story of this man who found the elixir of life. So that's what I had for you today. Let us know what you think about Nicolas Flamel. Do you think he was a real alchemist, or do you think he was a fraud? And do you think maybe he could have practiced alchemy, but he just didn't find the Philosopher's Stone and the elixir of life? Or do you think it was all complete baloney and he didn't even practice alchemy at all? Let us know what you think in the comments. Thank you for showing up. We will see you next time. And as always, stay uncanny.